For this video, we're going to talk a little bit about how families interacted in the 18th century, kind of focusing more on the common people and how they kind of interacted with their families, like I just said. So the first question is, how did the cottage industry grow? Now, peasants needed to always find ways to supplement their income. If you remember, we talked about this in regards to the Industrial Revolution in the AP world. But peasants needed to find ways to supplement their income, and manufacturers were willing to hire peasants since they could pay them less than city workers. And so the merchants, so the cottage industry was also referred to as the putting out system. The merchants would put out raw materials to the cottage workers, who would finish them and would be paid per piece. And this was an unregulated labor. So for the merchants, this meant they could experiment with different things and they could produce a wide variety of goods. At times, though, the merchants found it a little bit difficult to regulate their workers, and sometimes the work would come in spurts because you're dealing with peasants that kind of, are in their own cottages, overseeing their own things, and then sometimes they might be kind of put off by their own work on the farm, and they might kind of not be working as steadily as the merchants would like them to be. And so the merchants sometimes felt this was difficult. But in the 1700, industry was really more rural than urban. That's where most of the goods were being produced. And France and Germany also utilized the cottage industry as a means to help the landless poor. And so the family would engage in this work, and it would be work that would be done by the family. If they were a family of weavers, the loom would essentially dominate the small one-room cottage. The women would spin the thread while the men would weave the fabric. And that's why widows and unmarried women would be employed to spin thread, and that's why they were referred to as spinsters, an unmarried woman. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the family at this time. In northwestern Europe, the family structure tended to be nuclear and small, not more than 5 or 6 members. So mom, dad, 3 to 4 kids. And there was a high mortality rate, and late marriages usually prevented extended families. So these were nuclear families. In their early teens, children would leave home to work as servants. And they got married a little bit later than you would think. Men usually were over 26 and women were usually over 23. And the reason why they waited is because, like I said, in their early teens, they would leave home to work. Some of that money would go to their parents, and then some of that money would go to save to set them up for eventually when they were old enough to get married. So they would have children soon after their marriage. And it was also very common for women to be pregnant at marriage. So premarital sex was something that would happen rather regularly. In England, the estimation is about 1/3 of all children were conceived before marriage. In France, it was about 20%, about 1/5 of women were pregnant before they were married. And a new couple, even a lower class couple, would employ a servant. And they would be, young and hired under a contract to work for the household in exchange for room, board, and wages. So when these newly married couples hired this servant, that's the type of work that they would have done when they were in their early teens, saving up money to get married. They were not seen as socially inferior, and they were an important part of the family. If you were going into a trade, you'd be apprenticed between 7 and 14 years in order to fully learn the trade. And while you were apprenticed, you would not be permitted to marry. And they would usually have to travel, and this would usually be with men, they would travel from place to place looking for an odd job. It wasn't strange to work for between 8 to 10 years before you had the savings that you needed to start your own household. Now, in Eastern Europe, it was different. In Eastern Europe, you got married before the age of 20. And in some instances, actually, the wives were older than the husbands. Families were much larger, usually between 9 to 20 people living together with 3 to 4 generations living in the same home. And landlords, because in Eastern Europe you still had serfdom, landlords wanted to make sure that their land was being cultivated. So sometimes marriage between different manors were forbidden. So you wanted to kind of the landlords wanted to kind of keep everything, in their family. Not in their family, but on their manor, I should say. And there was many community controls in Eastern Europe, and you needed legal permission from the local lord in order to marry. People living outside a household, not with a family, was looked upon with an immense amount of suspicion because the household was the basic economic unit. And again, every member worked. In Western Europe, there was not enough land to go around, so men may leave home to work and then send wages back home to their wife and children, kind of leaving the responsibility of the farm to the wife. If you were a skilled artisan living in the city every member of the household would work in the running of the shop. And if the father died, this would bring a disaster to the household. The mother would usually seek to remarry as quickly as she possibly could, because she would need to have someone else to help support her and her children. And because mortality rates were very high back then, we see that there's a lot of second families and stepchildren. So when you think about like some of the stories, like the fairy tales, that there's always a wicked stepmother, and that's because extended families, like I said, were common during this time period. So what role really did the women play in this family? It really, as a woman, you're not going to be able to survive independently of a husband. So you devoted her life to maintaining her parents' household and then trying to gain a household for herself. And she would live at home until she was about 12 or 14. And then, like I said, she would leave home to become a servant. She would work to save enough money for her dowry. So sometimes she would help pay for her dowry. It wasn't just that her parents were paying for it. And the contributing to the starting of a household. In some instances, a girl's wages might go directly to her parents. And a lot of the girls were exploited. They had to work very, very hard. It was common for girls to be physically mistreated by their mistresses, and they really were at the mercy of their master, the son, and the friends. And if she got pregnant, through one of these exchanges, which more than likely was not the fault of her own, probably as a result of rape, she would be fired and thrown out in disgrace. In marriage, a woman's main concern was producing enough goods or money so that the family would survive. Now, women back then also didn't have large families like you would think. They commonly also, even the poor, lower class families, would send their children out to wet nurses, women who would breastfeed their children for them while they were young, so that she didn't have to stop from working. So women did work. If her husband owned a shop, she was helping to run the shop. If her husband worked on a farm, she was running the farm. So they did have a vital economic role in the family. So now finally, let's look at what role did children play in the society. So the birth of a child today is a time of great joy and happiness, but back then it was a time of fear, since death in childbirth was a very common occurrence. So you didn't know if the birth was going to go well. Infant mortality rate was very high. About 1 in 5 would die. In some of the poorer areas in Europe, it was as high as 1 in 3. A child, like I said, would be sent to a wet nurse for months or even years, depending on the work that the family had to do. And so this was a really big business in the 18th century. So poor women would use nursing. Poor women would be hired on as wet nurses and be taking care of all these children. So there really wasn't that early bonding, with your newborn, you think of that's so important today. Basically, you'd farm your child out and you'd come back a year or two later and be like, all right, hi, I'm mommy and daddy. It's a much different type of relationship. And some women who were very poor, who did have to nurse their own children, would do it to space out their children. So they wanted to try to space their children out because it's harder to get pregnant for nursing. They wanted to space out their children every 2 to 3 years. They didn't want to just have child after child after child. And children were not always welcome, because if you were a poorer family, this is a huge economic burden to have a child. So commonly you would see there was instances of infanticide, where families would murder their small children because they couldn't afford to support it. In the 17th and 18th century, we also see a rise in foundling hospitals. And that was really basically the favorite charity of the rich. And the foundling hospital is essentially an orphanage. In the 1770s, a third of all of the babies born in Paris were sent to foundling homes. And a third of those children were married couples that couldn't afford their child. So it wasn't that it was like an unwed mother situation. It was that it was a married family, but they just couldn't afford the child. 50 to 90%, depending on the orphanage, would die. 50 to 90% of the children would die in their first year. So putting your child into a foundling home was kind of like a legalized version of infanticide. And a young child really was of minor concern to the family because it was just so likely that they could die very easily that the families didn't really bond with their children until they were kind of old enough, until they knew they were going to actually live. The medical establishment focused very little on pediatric medicine because they were just so likely to die. But then it's like a vicious cycle because they were likely to die because they were essentially being neglected. And when parents did pay attention to their children, it really was to discipline them. Rousseau is going to kind of change the attitudes towards children and family in some of the books that he writes. He called for greater love and tenderness in raising your children. He also encouraged women breastfeeding their own children. And this was kind of like a transition when you start to see the Enlightenment. They begin, like I said, they begin to change the attitude that they had towards their children. But it's kind of a different attitude back then than what we would think of. So the last question, summary, how did family interaction differ between the upper and lower classes? How did families interact during this time? But this would be a better question. And I'll see you guys in class.